Well, everyone, let's get it started. And so I'd like to kind of start off with this. We talked about High Renaissance in Italy, and we talked about Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, and a few others that followed. And I think what I described it as was the culmination of all of this knowledge that they had gained over more than a century, since about 1400. And that knowledge included finding out, recovering the knowledge, the philosophy, the science, the wisdom from ancient Greece and Rome, as well as from Egypt, I should say, too, from antiquity, as well as their own research, investigation, and even to the point where we find notes and things from these Renaissance artists like Leonardo da Vinci. And we see that he had actually cut up cadavers so he could understand the human body more. And there were a lot of other discoveries and a lot more research, not just in anatomy and physiology. It was mathematics, science, everything. So anyway, we kind of centered that on Italy. And for a long time, how should I say this? Back when I was your age, they said that that was the Renaissance. Well, actually, there was a lot going on here in Northern Europe and mostly in this area here. But you see, this is early 16th century. So this is like 1500-ish. And by this time, we have England, France, Spain, and Portugal as countries. But more important is that we have this, and that is the Netherlands. You can see that kind of written out there in the English Channel, North Sea, Netherlands. And there was a lot of stuff going on there as well. And so now, today, after a lot of research and a lot of rethinking, we kind of know that even though they were independent, more or less, of each other, the Renaissance existed in both Northern Europe and in Italy as well. Different conditions, different governments. Actually, turns out that there becomes a different belief system. Much of what you see in this area here is what becomes Protestant. We see Martin Luther, actually, from Germany. So bottom line is that they are different. And I want to bring back my old analogy that I used in here some time ago. The difference being between Northern Renaissance and Southern Renaissance is kind of like the difference between an iPhone and an Android or a Samsung. They both do some of the same kinds of things. Some think one does things better than the other. They're both kind of alike and they're both kind of different. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And I want to kind of point out a couple of things on this map before I get away from it. You see this area here? It's called the Holy Roman Empire. You know what this is in this day and age? What we would call this? Germany. Germany, absolutely. And you see here in this boot-like peninsula. That would be, Wes, you know this too. Italy, absolutely. And what happens, this is a political thing, but it does affect the art, and it affects a lot of things. And in some ways, it affects who we are here today. How, we say, this was 500 years ago. Here's what happened. These countries, they organized as countries. This area organized the north here, what is now Germany, as part of the Holy Roman Empire, which kind of meant that they were subservient to Rome down here in Italy. And you see what is modern day Italy is a series of different city-states, papal states, if you will. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany with Florence as it, Genoa, Rome, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we have a central government, which is Rome, which is the church, but it's not organized like a country. I was thinking about this the other night when I was thinking, how am I going to explain this to you guys? Because I think this is critically important. And in 1776, we were organizing, rebelling in North America against the Europeans that pretty much colonized all of North America and South America. And you know the countries that did that. England, big time. France, which is right here where we are. St. Louis, a French colony until we bought it from the French in 1803, 1804, called the Louisiana Purchase. Spain, all of California, Arizona, Colorado, all of that land out west, and they still have Spanish names. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Santa Fe, San Diego, Spain. And the reason they could colonize was because they were organized as a country. They had a central government and they could organize their resources, which includes their natural wealth, it includes their population, it includes everything at their disposal, and they were run by kings, the King of France, the King of England, King of Spain, Ferdinand, and Isabella. Here, whoa, there it is. Spain, 1492, hires Columbus to find another trade route. You know the story. Bumped into North America, thought it was India. That's why we call Native Americans Indians for so long, because he thought he was in India and it stuck like a lot of misnomers. Bottom line, Spain came to the New World and they were followed by the French and the English, and they sent their boats over, they sent their people over, they colonized. And in a sad note, they didn't have enough people to pull this off. Hello, Randus. Have a seat. I know we moved the whole room's out of whack, so anywhere you like. But want to know, like the other part of that is that in the 17th century, these countries were actually stopping by Africa and kidnapping people and throwing them into slavery, because one thing these countries didn't have, they didn't have enough people to build a country. So let's get some slaves. Sad story, part of our history. But here's the issue. These countries were organized as countries. This part of Europe, not so much. Largely under the rule of the Pope, largely unorganized. And they fought with each other, these various papal states, city-states, and so on. So Italy was kind of the center of learning, and it was kind of like the Silicon Valley. If I use my smartphone analogy again. And when Spain wanted to get better, more efficient trade routes, what do? They hire an Italian. The guy was educated. He was educated in Italy, and they had all of this knowledge. This is what that Renaissance thing was all about. So a lot of things happened because of this, but these were the countries. And so I'm going to talk to you today about these countries and their artwork. And they experience the Renaissance too. And sometimes we call it the Northern Renaissance because it's physically, geographically different than Italy. And sometimes we just roll it into the High Renaissance. And so what these guys build on is some of the work by artists like Jan van Eyck. We saw that, Arnolfini and his wife, the one that David Hockney was on about, that chandelier, and how could he make this and this shine and all of this stuff. Well, this is what we did, and this is 1514. It's almost 100 years after Van Eyck, but you can still see they are really into detail. And it's quite possible that this was put together in the same way David Hockney described, camera obscura. And it's so exact that it's a pretty good, it's very likely that it was. But there's this exchange between Italy and Northern Europe. They couldn't keep their secrets. They influenced each other. And so I showed you an Italian High Renaissance painting of a convex mirror. And we see that here. So we know there's a lot of exchange going on. It took about 100 years, but basically they're both high functioning, and their artwork reflects that. The Money Changer and His Wife by Quentin Messis. And another great work from this period, Matthias Grunwald Eisenheim altarpiece. The top is closed and the bottom is open. This altarpiece, I'm going to zoom in on this because this is really quite something. It sort of reflects a difference in how the northern countries experienced Christianity versus how the Italians experienced and represented Christianity. So take a look at, this is pretty, we've seen this theme for 1500 years. Christ on the cross, St. John talking, and he's got the book in his hand. We know what that's about. It was prophesied that Christ would come. The Messiah, it's in the scriptures. And we have this other symbol here, frequently used. A lamb, and sometimes a lamb with a cross. And that's another metaphor for Christ himself, the Lamb of God. And if you're Catholic, or a lot of Protestant ritual talks about this too, Agnus Dei, Agnus meaning lamb, Dei meaning God, Lamb of God. So anyway, we know what is similar here. What is different, and I wish I could even zoom in more, but what is different about this, the way it's portrayed from what we see? What makes this stand out? And it does stand out. I tricked you. No. Well, let me suggest what's different. What we see in Italy, even when we see the dead Christ, we see the Pietà, we see lifeless, but the lifeless body of Christ. And we see that all the time, especially with Mother Mary holding the dead Jesus, the lifeless body. What we don't see in much or any of this is, look at those hands. You should see that skin. Well, if you take a look at it up close, it is, the flesh is, it's horrible. We see Christ, this is agony here. This is a very gruesome depiction of the crucifixion. And what we see for the most part, and for the centuries in all of these Christian cultures, is kind of an idealized crucifixion. You know, even to a point where you see these crucifixions where Christ is just kind of just like his eyes are open. He's on the cross, but he's looking back at you, and it's like he's impervious to all of the pain and torture that he has endured. Not so here. And so that's deliberate. This is very deliberate because the artist wants to remind you, wants to emphasize to you the actual gruesomeness, the cruelty, the agony that Christ went through. That's important. We're not idealizing. And in fact, centuries before this, there was always this kind of talk, this discussion among scholars, among biblical scholars, among clerics, of how you should depict the Christ. Because at the one time, he was put through this torturous death, but on the other hand, he's Christ. And because he's God, he rises above all of this. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. I always thought that this Eisenheim altarpiece was probably the most gruesome depiction of the crucifixion I'd ever seen, until I saw the movie, the Mel Gibson Passion of the Christ. Have you guys ever seen that? It's kind of old now. Yeah, some of you have. That like rocked my world when I saw it. That was awful. It was very graphic. Would you guys agree with that? It was kind of like this, except it was film. And so these are some of the differences in how they represent things. A couple other things of note. One, it's an altarpiece, which we haven't really seen any of that come out of Italy. They don't have portable altarpieces. They're not taking the altarpiece to the villages to celebrate Mass in different villages and for different purposes. They practice in Italy, they all have their own churches and their own altars and their own altarpieces and so on. And so this is meant to be portable, even though it's 9 feet high. But you could put it on a cart. You could take it to the next village, have you guys set it up and celebrate Mass. Another thing that's prominent on this, and we've seen this before in Northern Europe, the woodworking, the carving of all of this intricate detail laden with guilt. You know what that means? It means you feel bad about yourself. No, that's a different kind of guilt. This means that it's covered with gold leaf, a very thin coating of actual gold. And so, and as you can see, this is what it looks like when it opens up, and it's much wider. And the seam would be right down here through the middle. If you have it on your iPad, you can zoom in and see that. But at any rate, when we talk about the Renaissance, and I talked to you about Michelangelo, Raphael, Da Vinci, some people include Donatello, excuse me, and even Botticelli as an early Renaissance master. This guy is included in that bunch. And you see, this is 1500 as well, or very early 16th century. It's basically the same time period as what we're seeing with Michelangelo and Raphael and all those guys. And his name's Albrecht Dürer. I'm going to zoom in on part of this. And he is like Van Eyck in that way of depicting every minute detail. You can almost count the hairs on his beard. It's amazing. The way that his eyes, they look real. There's a little bit of shine on there. The anatomy, the hair, everything is very photographic. It's very realistic. It's very naturalistic. And here he is. He puts his own name on there, Albrecht Dürer. And I painted this in 1500 anno. And this is, it's kind of, I don't know how they got to that. But anyway, Albrecht Dürer. And this rivals what artists like Raphael and others were doing at the same time. So here's Albrecht Dürer. This is a watercolor. Great piece of turf. 1503. Early 16th century. Albrecht Dürer was, like his counterparts in Italy, a great student of nature. So they talked about Da Vinci cutting up cadavers and things and doing a lot of scientific research. Dürer was the same way. He was a botanist, And this, a great piece of turf. A lot of these watercolors, these botanical watercolors by Dürer are so exact that we know what these plants are. Even today, you could take this to an expert down at Shaw's Garden, for instance, and they would be able to identify these plants. And so, yeah, this is research. It's science. It's science and art. It's botany and art all coming together. And so I got a number of Dürer pieces here. This is from 1504. Engraving means that it's a metal plate and it has these lines and textures scratched into it. There are different ways that you can make that happen on a metal plate. But bottom line is that you can ink this up and run it through a press and print it repeatedly. And so a while back, we talked about the printing press and the proliferation of books. What we have here is the same thing happening with art, with pictures. And so you could, a lot of Dürers don't really necessarily end up as being illustrations in a book. They're mostly standalone prints. And so that's why you don't get a lot of the other information here, because it is a print. It was meant to be reproduced and it was meant for wide distribution. There's something else going on here too. Albrecht Dürer, and I made this and so on. Something else going on here. I want to kind of point this out. What about the nudity? What?
It's censored.
Center.
Censored.
Oh, censored. Yes, absolutely. Gotcha. Yeah. What we have going on in Renaissance Italy, we start to see very unabashed, uncensored nudity. Not always, but a lot of times. We saw Michelangelo, who did the creation of Adam. We've seen his statue of David. We saw Donatello's David. So anyway, and we've seen a lot of other depictions of the human being unclothed, but here, just by the subject matter, Adam and Eve need to be unclothed. It says so in the Bible. They were naked. And after they ate from the tree of knowledge, then they realized their nakedness. I think that's how that's said. But anyway, yeah, Brandis, you're right on. Censored. We put leaves and stuff strategically in place. And there's something else that happens at this time too. Happens with Michelangelo, happens with Dürer. We don't know why this is, but oftentimes they depict the nude female body almost like the male body, with some breast kind of put on them. And so you'll see they're very much more muscular, different, but that was kind of how they did it. And so, yeah, Adam and Eve, and there's the snake, the devil, the temptation. Albrecht Dürer, night, death, and the devil. Another engraving. This is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And look down here, lower left-hand corner. 1513, Albrecht Dürer. He was famous for putting his initials right on the front of anything that he painted or engraved, printed, etc. We didn't see this before. And in fact, prior to this time, this would have been seen as being profoundly egotistical. Today, in today's world, we expect to see the signature of the artist, oftentimes in front. One of the great ones, Picasso, big letters. Monet put across, I mean, you know, it's just commonplace, but this was really quite outstanding. And so Dürer, like in his culture, in his day, they like to put together these allegories about life, about death, about being a good person, about how death is always at your front door, as they say. And this is another interesting aspect of Dürer. And that is that he made these prints that have as much as anything to do with psychology. Melancholia. What is melancholia? It's got it written there. Melancholia. What does that mean? Well, it's kind of an antiquated term, but the best translation or a good translation is depression, melancholy. You ever hear the word? That's what this is, melancholy. And they understood even then as today. We understand mental health, we understand depression, we understand that it is an affliction. And that's what he has here, melancholia. And he has another one here. Whoa, oh, no, this is, okay. Did too much here. Melancholia. And another thing that he did he was in a part of Europe that wasn't really particularly organized as a country, the Netherlands, but they were kind of in on the show of colonizing the world and trading around. That's why we have like the original colonizers of New York were the Dutch, and they called this New Amsterdam. So anyway, Dürer comes from that part of the world. And one of the things that these countries were doing, that were organized, and they had navies and were sending people out to trade with the rest of the world and stuff. They were becoming familiar with a lot of animals that are not in the natural fauna of Europe. These are exotic animals. And this is a rhinoceros. So anyway, and he was a guy that was a nature illustrator. We saw that with the great piece of turf. We see this with the rhinoceros. Now, in a lot of ways, this is probably an exaggerated version of a rhinoceros. And we think that it's an exaggerated picture because what he had to go with was written accounts of what a rhinoceros looked like, about how big they were. And so this rhinoceros has the scales and things, kind of kind of a little over the top, but bottom line, he was a scientist. This, I didn't put the title on here. This is St. Jerome in his study. That's the title of this. It's an Albrecht Dürer engraving, and you can see over here, he's got his signature down, very, very well disguised. One of the philosophers that a lot of these people in Central Europe looked up to was Saint Jerome. He was a monk, he was a scholar, and he was an authority on biblical things. But that's not why I brought this in. I wanted to show you something a little different. We see the 1-point perspective here. You guys see that? How that all comes, it's basically the horizon line. It mostly comes right to St. Jerome. But this bench, that's not in the 1-point perspective. The perspective for this would be the same horizon line to be sure, but the vanishing point would be somewhere over here. I showed you that with the School of Athens and Raphael, and we see that here with Albrecht Dürer. And so this is the kind of evidence that you can point to know that there was this exchange of these artistic ideas, whether it was a direct exchange or whether they just saw what others were doing and trying to figure it out. But at any rate, that's why they call this the High Renaissance. All these things are kind of reaching the apex. It's hard to top. It's hard to top a painting this exact or this exact. This would stand up in today's world as a great work of art and so on. So Albrecht Dürer, Four Apostles, and this is from City Hall in Nuremberg, Germany. And there's something going on here we've talked about before. Kind of happening a little bit here and kind of happening here. And that is that dark background. The idea of creating darkness behind your subject and shining a strong light from the front. Dark modeling, chiaroscuro, Italian word for this kind of, this means of creating space. And so anyway, Dürer is the titan, the giant of the age. But he wasn't the only one making art. There are different kinds of artists doing different kinds of things. And this is Cranach the Elder, Law and Gospel. And you can see a lot of things happening here. It's really kind of, again, another allegory, a picture that tells a story. And so we have Christ, the Holy Spirit, the illumination, and people see the light, if you will. People being punished for their sins, etc. God in heaven judging the souls, Adam and Eve, all of this. This is a morality play. This is a design to show you what is right and what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. Cranach the Elder, 1530, Judgment of Paris, comes right out of Greek mythology. And you can see Cranach's, he doesn't really have the same skill set that we see in Albrecht Dürer. But in some ways, like I say, these things were trade secrets. And the story for some of these, much more important. Which is Sabbath. That's another thing that we're finding here in the north, 1510. I'm talking about this kind of stuff. With this, I want you to keep in mind what was happening with the change in how Christianity was being practiced in Northern Europe. A lot of those same cultures brought some of these same ideas over with them to the New World. And so, which is Sabbath in this day and age, and subsequently in New England, in Salem, Massachusetts. Well, you know where I'm going with this. There's the Salem witch hunt. They brought the idea of witches from Europe over to the New World, and it was something they so fervently believed in that they would kill people they thought were involved in witchcraft. And so, yeah, this is 3 ages of woman and death. And so, yeah, this is kind of another one of those allegories, a story about the baby woman, the adult young woman in the height, in her prime of her beauty. And you can see she's got a mirror. She's kind of a little bit of vanity going, but she knows this is her prime. And then the elderly woman here, and this guy, death. And this is just like some of the other ones I've already shown you. Death at your door. Death is always there. So you be good, because death can snatch you away at any time. And so, yeah, this is a whole different way of looking at things than what we've seen in Italy. Battle of Issus. And again, I think probably as much as anything, what I want to say about this is the idea that we see in Leonardo, in the Mona Lisa, that he created this large invented landscape behind the Mona Lisa. This is an invented landscape too. It wasn't like Altdorfer went and found this place. He just made it up. So when you know how to paint, when you know how to do these things, as they say, the sky's the limit. And Holbein, he's kind of a noted painter, and Hans Holbein was a Dutch painter, but he kind of went back and forth between the Netherlands and England. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But he painted this. This is a portrait of the French ambassadors. And there's been a lot of discussion over the centuries about what this really was about. And there is some scholarship on this. And I'll talk about it this way, that all of this stuff here, it says something about these two guys, the French ambassadors. First of all, we got a globe here. So they knew about the world, they knew about geography. There are books here. There's some scientific, what would pass as scientific paraphernalia up here. Got a lute, got sheet music, etc. This is supposed to show you that these were cultured people. This is how you did it. And there had been some discussion that Holbein was painting these French ambassadors. You see where it's at the National Gallery in London. Painted pictures, portraits of these guys so that King Henry would know these were the real ambassadors. Because we didn't have photographs at the time, you didn't have an ID card, and so somebody as important as the delegates, the ambassadors from a rival superpower, you really need to know who they were and that these were the real guys. And some scholars say that this is the reason it was painted. And along with that, there's this thing. You might know what that thing is. Mistake. What?
A skull.
It is. Wes. Right on. It's a skull. It doesn't look like a skull, except for if you were to turn this image and look at it from the side here, it would look like a skull. It's kind of distorted and elongated. And there are scholars that talk about why that is there. But Holbein in German means, translates into hollow bone. And so the skull may be in its own way a kind of authentication, a signature that Holbein actually painted this. So it's a kind of a seal of authentication of some sort. And so, but you can see in terms of the technical issues, they pretty much, like the Italian counterparts, they have all this all figured out. They know how to make patterns on the tile floor. They know how to keep the patterns on the drapery consistent with the folds in the drapery. They know how to create the illusion of light and shadow and so on. And so this is Hans Holbein, Henry VIII. This is a very famous portrait of Henry VIII. And as I was saying, the French ambassadors painted it for Henry VIII. And in fact, Holbein was the court painter for Henry VIII, famous King of England, the one who founded the Church of England because he wanted to divorce his wife and the Pope wouldn't let him. They said, fine, we'll start the Church of England and forget about Rome. And so anyway, yeah, and there's been so much written about this guy. And he had what, six wives of Henry. Used to know him, Anne Boleyn, Catherine. Oh, anyway, never mind. Too much for this old man. But at any rate, yeah, very famous, consequential king. And again, technically right there. Here's another very famous painting of the era, Hieronymus Bosch, The Garden of Earthly Delights. And there's so much here. It's put together like an altarpiece. And it really is there to depict a story about humankind. And basically it's about how delving into pleasurable pursuits and other kinds of lewd activity will land you in hell. And so, but at any rate, they start off with this, and this is the Adam and Eve. We've seen that a lot of times, and we see the Garden of Eden, and we see all of the flora, the fauna, all of the various birds and animals, and it's just Edenic. But there's a lot of stuff here that we really don't know what this is all about. For instance, what's this? We're not really sure. We see the birds all flying. This is probably bats, but at any rate, we see an abundance of life and abundance of nature. And so this is the first panel. The second panel, this is like really strange. I want to point out something at this juncture, and that is that all of this stuff about knowledge and science and learning and anatomical studies and the idea of modeling and creating an illusion of space, that's all out the window. This is in a lot of ways very retro, extremely retro for the time. And it's been said that the guy who painted this, Hieronymus Bosch, was probably the last of the great medieval painters. That is, that he painted this in a way that predated all of this Renaissance knowledge. And so anyway, but what you see here, it's all a bunch of naked people, and they're doing all kinds of debauchery here. They're copulating, they're doing all kinds of things. It's considered to be sinful. And that's really what this center panel depicts. And then the final panel over here is really strange. There are a lot of things we don't really know what's going on. There's this strange little, see where I got my hand there? This strange little portrait right there that's really kind of Renaissance-like. Almost as though we got something that was cut and paste into this, because the rest of this is depicted in a whole other style. But what you see here is all kinds of things. This is hell. And this guy on a harp, it's like he's crucified. There are different kinds of things, these weird creatures that are human and have a bird's head. All of these things that almost comes right out of Shangar, the guy you wrote about, the Temptations of Saint Anthony. And so anyway, that's really kind of what's happening here. And this, again, is a whole world apart from the kinds of depictions of faith that we see in the Italian Renaissance. So we got witches, we got gruesomeness, we got sin and sinners, we got a level of modesty, we got a lot of things that are different in the North. And so I want to point this out. This is where this painting has been for centuries. Museo del Prado, Madrid. This is an important part of this piece. It's important to the history. It's important to the provenance. Can't really tell this story without pointing out that this, and still to this day, is on display at the National Museum, which is the Prado in Spain. How many of you guys know about Salvador Dali? Yes, some. Surrealist. He's the guy that painted the melted clocks. And you'll see this still on posters and things. It's all over the internet. He's a surrealist and painted a lot of stuff right out of his dreams. Dreamscape surrealism. And he talked about his major influence as he was growing up as this painting. Hieronymus Bosch. And if you know Dali and you take a look at something like this almost looks like a Dali painting. Just saying. And so, more of the same kinds of things. This is another Neptune and Amphitrite, excuse me, painted kind of like Adam and Eve, and kind of in its own way, still that kind of modesty that we wouldn't find. Saint Luke drawing the Virgin Mary. This is kind of an interesting picture. I'm not going to ask you guys what your religion is or anything. That would be improper. But in the Catholic religion and a lot of the Protestant offshoots, Lutheranism and so on, there's an idea of patron saint. And so whatever you do, there's typically a patron saint that you can turn to for inspiration, somebody you can pray to. And so we talked earlier, in the early Renaissance, about Saint Christopher, patron saint of travelers, because he had carried the Christ child across the turbulent river. Saint Luke, the same Saint Luke of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is said he is the patron saint of doctors, because he was a doctor, he was a physician, and he is the patron saint of artists. And at least according to the belief system, he painted the first portrait of the Virgin Mary, and he did it when she was still alive. Obviously, first century, common era. And so that's what this is. Now, is this very realistic? Only in style, because if this ever happened, it likely did not happen as this is depicted. But bottom line is that in some ways, the tradition lives on. The Reformation, not a complete breakaway from fundamental Christian beliefs. A lot of it's still the same, and this is an example of that. And so, I've been talking too long. It's like after 6. Now let me finish this up. One of the things that happens in Northern Europe too is that they start depicting subjects that are not the usual subjects for artistic creation. Look at this. This is a butcher's stall. This is a marketplace. And this is where, back in the day, this was your meat shop. This was Schnucks or something. Bottom line, that's how things work. And in many places in the world, it's still that way. They have open markets that look kind of like Soulard, for example, a marketplace. And the butcher's stall, that's what this is. And this would be the guy that would have all the meat. And he got some fish, he got cow's head there, got a side of beef, chickens, etc. I had the pleasure of going to an open market like this in China when I was there. And their butchers were not that much different than here. And as a matter of fact, they often had live animals there. You could put the live animal in a sack and take it home and butcher it yourself. But at any rate, just like this, on South Grand, Wei Hung, you guys ever heard of this? It's on South, it's by South Grand in Wyoming, I think. Anyway. Chinese restaurant, Connecticut Street, one of them, one of the states that go across there. It's not like Tar Grove Park. Anyway, they have a bakery and a butcher shop, Chinese, and they got like geese hanging. If they're in the window, you can see them from the sidewalk, from the street. And so this is what things look like. Now, would this have been subject matter before this time? I think not. We don't really see this. It's like so common and so ordinary, but these artists really kind of bring up the ordinary. And that's another difference between Italian Renaissance and what goes on in the North. Can I gross you guys out like really big? This thing right here, intestines. Just say it. But a lot of sausage is made with intestines. They would take some of the meat and chop it up and shove it in the intestines, cut it off, tie the ends, and just say it. And this is what it would look like once they were stuffed. And so, yeah, a butcher's stall. There's another woman artist of the era, Katarina van Hemsen. And again, one of the things that I didn't say yet to this point, that's a very important point indeed. Oftentimes, what we see from these artists, women, men, it doesn't matter, usually has a bit of salespersonship to go along with what they're painting. And so Katarina van Hemsen, she's doing a self-portrait, obviously. But if you wanted to know how good she was, you could look at this picture and say, wow, she really knows how to create a very, very great likeness. Because this is her. And so we get that sometimes. Not like all self-portraits are that way, but sometimes you get works like this. And part of the salespersonship of this was that Peter Erikson could paint this before it went bad. And that's why I like to paint flowers too, because they could get them painted and captured before they wilted. Or they would take an orange and peel it and put it on the windowsill, and the artist would be able to paint that before it rotted, got bad, before it turned. And so there's some of that going to be factored into this. But another woman artist, Elizabeth I, as a princess. Joachim Patiner, a landscape with Saint Jerome. As I was saying, he was a monastic, he was a scholar, he was kind of one of the great Christian philosophers of the day. And you can see over here the skull, always the reminder of death. That would be called a memento mori. Memento, a reminder, mori, death, like a mortician. Memento mori, and the Christ, and here he is, Saint Jerome. But at any rate, they did a lot of Peter Bruegel, the elder. And I think that these are the Netherlandish proverbs. And this is just regular people in a regular village. Again, I'm talking about what we would call genre painting, the ordinary stuff like this. Like this. Bruegel. And so this is it. This is life in the village. And you see all kinds of activity, none of it particularly epic, none of it particularly noteworthy. It's not like a great battle. It's not a scene out of the Bible. It's just ordinary people doing ordinary things. I want to kind of point to this one. And this is kind of one of the more famous Bruegel paintings, Hunters in the Snow. Again, ordinary people, ordinary things. These guys are out for the hunt. They have their they have their hunting dogs and they have their spears. It's like pre-rifles and stuff. And then you see down here on the frozen pond, people are ice skating. And so, and over here, people they got a fire and they're probably cooking, they're probably getting ready for what these hunters bring back. Ordinary people, ordinary things. And I have to kind of end on this little observation. See, when this was painted, 1565, it was in the midst of what was called the mini ice age. In the 16th century, it got really cold for a long time in Europe. And this is a depiction of a mini ice age. And in fact, where this was supposed to be, it hardly ever snowed or anything. Bottom line, people talk about paintings like this to kind of try to figure out what was really going on in the 16th century in Europe. We know of a few things, though. We know that in the forest, especially in the forest in northern Italy and southern Switzerland, that ice age had a profound effect on the trees because there was not much of a summer, a growing season, if you will. And so, as you know, the rings on the tree, you can count them, and that's how old the tree is. Every year is another ring. And what they found is that wood from northern Italy and southern Switzerland, the rings are real tight. There you can hardly tell the rings apart because it had a very short season where they would leave, and then it was fall and winter again. The winters were really long. Why am I going on about this? Stradivarius, violin maker from Italy from this time, or used trees that were from this ice age. And they always wonder, how did he make these violins sound so sweet? It was because of this mini ice age. He used trees that were grown under these conditions. And so anyway, there's a lot of science you can pull from the art. There's a lot of other connections. A lot of the connections are political, historical, religious. You can tell how people thought about things. You can tell what people thought was important by taking the time and making paintings and sculptures of it. So, any questions? Not even questions about, is the room going to be put back together? That I don't know. So, that being it. Oh, finally, I knew there was something I'm going on. I could tell you about. February 21st, 2 weeks from today. Did you guys hear about this? No classes, mental health day. Yeah, I saw that clapping back there. Yeah, you wanted to come in and listen to me on YouTube or, yeah, well, anyway, I'm glad they're doing it too. And so that's all I have for today, you guys. So stay warm and you'll be good. Thank you. Bye. Yeah, you bet. No ice pack today.
Oh, no.
You got plenty of ice outside. So, yeah. I will.